And just FYI, this last month's presentation was about 2.5 hours long. This is not going to be that long. Never again. There'll be two-parters if they need to be that long.
Special occasion.
Yeah, and this will be in this case. I think there's more. It's very interesting from a chess perspective. So there'll be quite a bit of chess and a little bit less biography than in Fischer, for sure. Okay, so the life and chess of Viktor Korchnoi. If you're keeping track, this is part 8 of a planned 12-part series. Next month, it's going to be Karpov. Then we'll have Kasparov 1 and 2. And then for the last one, we thought about doing something a little different, maybe doing Judith Polgar. We'll see if we can do that. So again, I'm Lucas Anderson. I am a librarian by day, but I coach chess with some middle and upper schoolers at the Houston Open, for example, last weekend. And behind me is Warren Harper, who's going to be doing the chess analysis. He is a FIDE master and a computer scientist by day, but a very strong chess player by night. You can see his USCF rating, even after the Houston Open, is creeping up toward that 2,500 mark. So we're looking at Viktor Leivovich Korchnoi. It is spelled sometimes a little differently. Even, for example, in the books I brought, on one of them you have Korchnoi, the first spelling, and on the second one you have Korchnoi, the second spelling. So even in things that he's written that have his name on it, sometimes they're spelled different ways. And Viktor is sometimes spelled with a K, sometimes with a C. Korchnoi was born March 23rd, 1931, and like some of the players we've covered in this series, notably Spassky, I guess just Spassky, he's still alive. So here you have pictures of Korchnoi with his father. This is Korchnoi around age 9. And then to the right, you have a picture. You might think that's Korchnoi with his mother. That's actually his stepmother. So Korchnoi's father was named Lev, hence Viktor Leivovich Korchnoi. And his stepmother, who was more of a mother to him than his mother ever was named Rosa Abramovna Korchnoi. So these are probably the earliest pictures of Korchnoi, and they come essentially from his autobiography, as many of the images in tonight's presentation do. So Viktor's father, Lev, was per Viktor, he was a teacher of Russian language and literature. And then during the war, he worked he learned to become a refrigeration engineer, and he worked at a confectionery factory. And that's where he met, incidentally, Viktor's stepmother, Rosa, who was also working at this confectionery factory. Now, when the siege of Leningrad began in 1941, Viktor's father was enlisted into the army, as were many able-bodied men of the time period. And you may remember from our lecture on the Soviet School of Chess that Lev Korchnoi was a driver who drove supply trucks across frozen Lake Ladoga in the winter. And, And the city of Leningrad is sieged essentially on all sides, so the only way to get relief into the city is over the frozen Lake Ladoga. But the German military knows this, and so in the months where the lake is not frozen, you have air bombers who are dropping bombs on these relief convoys. And in the winter, when it's frozen, you have artillery shooting and blowing holes in the lake that trucks might eventually fall through. And this is what happened to Lev Korchnoi, who died sometime around November 1941 when the truck that he was driving there was an impact of an artillery shell nearby, and the truck sank to the bottom. So Viktor lost his father at age 10. Now, his mother was not really present. And what's interesting is in the autobiography that Korchnoi wrote, This Chess is My Life, he doesn't even mention the name of his mother. And I've looked online, not exhaustively, but I've looked in a couple different places, and I can't even find her name. Korchnoi doesn't mention her name. He just says that she was capricious by nature, and that her and his father divorced when Viktor was young. Viktor's father received custody of Viktor. The mother sued in court 6 times unsuccessfully to try to obtain custody of Viktor. Also, Korchnoi talks about the fact that he, like many children, was put on a train out of Leningrad before all the routes were closed off. You can see there were some rail routes going into the interior of the country, and a lot of people, like Spassky, were evacuated on these trains. Spassky at age 4 was evacuated, and we talked about that in his lecture. Viktor was on one of those trains. The mother actually tracked down where Viktor was in one of these camps and brought him back to Leningrad. And so he spent the siege of Leningrad, all 800-ish or 900-ish days of it, in Leningrad under really terrible conditions. He saw his grandmother die in essentially of hunger that was complicated by illness. Her name was Elena, and that was the only grandparent that Viktor knew. One of his grandfathers had died in World War I. The other, one of his grandmothers, had been killed during the Russian Revolution. And this was his last surviving grandparent, and she died in March of 1942. And this left Viktor without a father and without his father's mother, his paternal grandmother, in the span of about 4 months. And so, and he doesn't talk about his mom after this point. Essentially, he was raised by a stepmother. She took him in, and she worked in a confectionery factory, which was beneficial for Viktor because it meant that they could get some food. Now, you may recall in the Soviet School of Chess lecture, I talked about the Siege of Leningrad. I talked about the fact that the ration was 125 grams of bread per day, which was 4 to 5 ounces of bread per day, and it was cut with sawdust and all sorts of other things. It was not particularly nourishing or helpful. It was a desperate time. Cannibalism existed. Viktor talks about losing his cat. This cat just disappeared one day, likely taken by a hungry family. And he also talks about the fact that as his older relatives died of hunger or exposure because they didn't have firewood to heat their homes, he and his brother were tasked with taking the family member out, putting them on a cart, waiting for them to freeze, and then either taking them to the cemetery like we see here, or waiting for different militias and other organizations that existed to come around and collect the bodies. So by our measure, this is very difficult to imagine. Viktor doesn't talk about it in great depth. In fact, he talks about it in terms of when Finland pulled back to their original borderlines, how it kind of eased the blockade and allowed some life to return to Leningrad, and how it allowed him to have more to eat and to start playing chess again. So surviving a great deal of adversity, to say the least. So we've talked about people who became child prodigies. Spassky comes to mind. We've also talked about people that worked really hard, and Korchnoi probably fits that second descriptor better. He won his first major tournament in 1947 when he won the USSR Junior Championship. Here's a picture from his final round match. Interestingly, when Korchnoi started analyzing the games that he played against some of his opponents, he found that a couple of the opponents had been persuaded into losing to him intentionally. He would ask him, well, why'd you make this move? This is a losing move. And they would kind of say, and upon pressing, he found that it was because party officials and sports authorities had convinced them to. And it's interesting to note that this sort of manipulation started very, very, very early. In Korchnoi's case, he's 16 years old when this happens. And this is a pattern we'll see repeated for many, many decades. Korchnoi had help along the way. He had several different coaches. In his book, he credits Andrei Betuev, who I couldn't find an image of, Abram Model, and Vladimir Zak. Vladimir Zak we've seen because he was a coach to young Boris Spassky. They grew up in the same town, Leningrad, and even you'll see that Korchnoi and Zak co-authored a book on the King's Gambit. They remained close until Korchnoi defected in the mid-70s, and Korchnoi makes a point to say this is not the case with Spassky. Spassky moved on, to other coaches and kind of left Zak behind, notably Toulouche, who offered to coach Korchnoi, and Korchnoi said no. So he did have some help along the way, and he did become quite a strong player. won the USSR Junior Championship twice, and then, as we will see, he enjoyed a pretty strong rise to the top of the Soviet chess world. But before we see that, let's look at our first game of the evening. This is Korchnoi versus Tal. Tal, you may recall, was infamous for his famous stare, and you might notice that Korchnoi was meh about it. He was not thrown off by Tal's efforts at intimidation. For that, I'll turn it over to Warren.
Thanks, Lucas. So one of the first things I'll point out is that among the games I selected, let me just see if I can go find the library real quick. So I picked out 4 games for tonight, and in 3 of them he was black. Now, so far in the series we've done, almost all the games the player's been white. And this is kind of a testament to Korchnoi's general style of play in that he loved to counterattack. Now with white, you're usually attacking, not counterattacking. So this is probably why he had so many good games with the black pieces. Kasparov mentions the same thing in his book when he did a filter of his games and picked out about 40 or so, and the majority of them were games where Korchnoi had the black pieces. So I came up with this analogy. I don't know if somebody else came up with this and I didn't hear it, but you know, with Petrosian was more of a waiting kind of player. Tal was more provocative. The difference is that with Petrosian, the saying from Napoleon comes to mind about when your enemy's in the process of making a mistake, don't interrupt them. Right? That was like Petrosian. Korchnoi was far more provocative, though. I liken him more to like a Venus flytrap. You know, putting something taunting in front of your opponent, just like I don't know what. There's like a low-hanging fruit kind of deal, and they grab it, and then he punishes you for it kind of deal. So that's kind of what his style was like, in my opinion, and you'll kind of see some of that in these games. Now, Korchnoi's record against Tal was pretty good. You know, even I think at some point, even after Tal was an ex-world champion, he still had not beaten Korchnoi. He had lost to him 5 times and drawn a bunch of others.
5 times.
Yeah, 5 times.
Tal liked to say, my record against you is 5 and 5. 5 losses, 5 draws.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was until like 1968 or something like that until Tal finally defeated Korchnoi in 1 game. By the time he did that, Korchnoi had accumulated 9 wins. So Tal really had a really hard time with Korchnoi. And part of it, too, is the fact that this played exactly into what Korchnoi wanted. It was kind of unsettling for Tal. You know, I'm sure Tal was used to people being intimidated by his reputation. You know, he would threaten a sacrifice and people would kind of cower. But Korchnoi would, you know, Tal would threaten a sacrifice and he would welcome it. You know, it's like, go ahead, do it, see what happens. You know, kind of thing. So, anyway, we'll see that happen in this game. So you'll see the opening here is the French, and this was one of his favorites. And this is a great opening if you have this kind of counterattacking style that he did, because you're just begging white to gain space. Of course, the downside of having space is that you can become overextended. It can be hard to defend your pawns. So it's a perfect setup for a counterattack. Risky, of course, but this was something that Korchnoi didn't shy away from. So for this game, Korchnoi prepared something special. He played this move knight f5, which is not a very strong move, and this was the first and last time he played this in his career. But he did this on purpose because he was kind of messing with Tal psychologically. So with bishop d3, white just threatens to take the knight and take on g7. So this h5 move is very logical, because now the white queen cannot eye this g7 pawn. Now it turns out the best move for white here is queen f4. But Korchnoi knew that Tal would not play this because black can play queen h4 and trade queens. Now, white has a clearly better endgame because of the 2 bishops. But despite this, he knew Tal didn't like this. So he played this on purpose, poor variation of the French, just because he knew Tal would not exchange queens. So kind of amusing, I think. So instead, Tal plays the passive queen h3. Right? The queen's just kind of tucked on the side. It's okay for white, but black is doing quite fine. So here, the reason that white can't just take back because black just wins the pawn for free, right? So with knight f3, he threatens that. Now queen c7 is accurate because white cannot take this pawn because it's check on c3, right? So white moves a rook out of the way. Now white's trying to kick this knight out of the center. And actually, one of the reasons I didn't mention this before that Tal played this line is that this variation had been evaluated as good for white by some of the contemporary players. I think their analysis stopped after bishop f4 because they thought white was going to play rook g1, and then this g-pawn would just be a very weak point. And they considered moves like, say, bishop d7, rook g1, king f8, and they determined that this was just, a really good position for white, basically, right? But Korchnoi found a nice move, knight g6. This is something that Tal had not analyzed. So, of course, the obvious problem is that he can't take the knight because of the pin, right? And if he doesn't, then he's going to lose his e-pawn. Now here, it would not be a good idea to trade this light-squared bishop because this is a very important piece for white. Not only is it white's good bishop, so to speak, in this kind of position, but it leaves the queen side kind of weak. So let's pose Tal with some problems. Unfortunately, he has to give up his last center pawn. Now this pin on the knight may look dangerous, but it turns out it's not really so easy for white to exploit. So here he plays king f1 to avoid this check on d3, so it just maintains that pin on the knight. And black's preparing the castle queenside. And here was another mistake from Tal here. So he should have just played rook e1, trying to exploit this pin, right? This move forces f6. Okay. And now he can play a move like rook g1 and threaten to take on e5 and then g7, and he has his passed h-pawn. So this he could have attained some pressure. Now it's still very complicated in this kind of position that Korchnoi liked, right? All of these massive center pawns. It's pretty interesting. But this would have been a better path. Queen h4 doesn't turn out to be so good. Now black is able to consolidate here. Now it looks like white's still doing well because black's king doesn't look too safe. White has his active rook, but Korchnoi immediately neutralizes it. So he's trying to get rid of this rook right away. It looks like a dangerous position, but again, Korchnoi is resourceful. So this move may look really bizarre, right? Your king's getting attacked, and you just move more pawns around your king, right? It doesn't make much sense, but the idea is that after white takes his g-pawn, then the king side is actually blocked. Surprisingly, black's king is quite safe. So it's of course risky endgame because you give white these two passed pawns, but black's doing fine. So white's trying to join his comrade on g6, right? I say comrade because these are two Russians, right? Yeah. Now a5, the purpose of this move is to stop white from playing queen b4, threatening queen e7, right? Now white's trying to eye this c3 pawn, but at this point it's about equal. Unfortunately, Tal tries to push though. And here's where he blundered. He should have just retreated his queen and accepted that the position is a draw. Okay. Now the problem with his move he played in the game is that it doesn't work. He thought he had a passed g-pawn, but of course here, black wins with what?
Queen takes g6.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And
white doesn't have a chance.
Yeah, and white doesn't have any reply, right? Take back the queen, and then black has winning endgame. It's too much. So I think this game really just illustrates how provocative Tal is. Plays this poor move on purpose just because he knows Tal doesn't like an endgame. It's definitely playing the psychology aspect of chess, right? So, does anybody have any questions about this game?
Why didn't he go chasing pawns on a7 earlier?
The rook. Out? Okay, so let's go back. So after rook b8, you mean rook takes a7?
Yeah, right. Yeah, rook takes a7.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Or was it that rook would just give activity to the rook coming down? To
So
check?
rook takes a7. I think black can... Oh, he can't take an h5. Just
Check on b1.
Well, I'm not... Check and then king g2. I mean, this is...
What about followed by a queen check on e1? Sorry, rook takes rook, king takes rook, queen e1.
And then king g2. I think that's... I think... I have a feeling the problem might just be d4. And I think the issue, is that white's rook is stranded on a7. Now, the idea of this move is to have bishop c6.
Yeah.
So, for example, now he's threatening rook b1, king g2, bishop c6, which is now decisive, right?
Yep.
And here, it's not really obvious to me what white can do. I think he just didn't take a7 because his rook is misplaced. Yeah. So, although the rook is active on the 7th in general, here it doesn't really have a target. So I think that's why he didn't take. Any other questions? Yeah, don't repeat knight f5. It's not a good move. That endgame is terrible for black. But if you're playing tall, maybe you can consider it.
So we've talked a little bit about the fact that Korchnoi and Spassky were in the same town, not quite the same age. I think Korchnoi is about 6 years older, but there is a picture that you have right after the siege of Leningrad of some of the young players in Leningrad, and you see a picture of, you see Korchnoi there, you see Vladimir Zak, you see Alexander Toulouche, you see Boris Spassky being, quite young there. And Zak was kind of the representative of the sports committee. Now, under the communist regime, the sports committee was charged with promoting chess and helping the Soviet youth develop and helping the Soviet chess players assert dominance in chess arenas internationally. And so Zak was kind of in charge of recommending young players for stipends. Now, stipends we've talked about a little bit, but stipends were extremely important to budding chess players because they essentially gave you an income without necessarily having a job. This was quite exceptional in the Soviet Union, where the working class was considered the ideal class. And so the ability to make a living and being able to support your family and having your rent paid and being able to afford suits and things, that essentially all flowed from the state. So you had to be in very good graces with the state. And we talked about it a little bit with the Soviet school lecture, how there's this system of favors and what have you, and some were better at navigating it than others. And we'll get to that in a bit. But know that Korchnoi, and this book was written in 2004, this picture below was taken in 2009, but he's very careful to say that Spassky was not his friend, but they were on amicable terms. Now, this distinction is that Spassky and Korchnoi had some shared experiences, but Spassky was in some ways part of the political framework that Korchnoi struggled with, and so that sometimes put them at odds, and obviously their chess careers put them sometimes at odds because they were often contenders for the same world championship cycle. But they played a match in 2009, and given the press conferences afterward, it looks like, if nothing else, nostalgia made them friendly well after Korchnoi's book was written. Now, Warren talked a little bit about Korchnoi's match record against Tal. I wanted to show that for you. What is remarkable about his match record is against the strongest players of his time period, Korchnoi had an equal or better record. He had a positive record against Petrosian, although there are quite a few draws. He had a dominant record against Tal, and there's a little quote there about it below it. He was equal with both Botvinnik and with Fischer. And I don't know of any other player from this time period who could claim this. Now, Korchnoi did have his weaknesses. There were players who gave him trouble. Karras comes to mind. But Korchnoi probably had the best match record of any non-world champion, of anybody that I've looked at carefully, actually, particularly against strong players. And this is one reason why I thought Korchnoi was deserving of his own evening and his own lecture, because his playing was so strong. Also, there's the political struggle, and then finally there's the longevity, which is remarkable. But know that his match record was extremely good against his contemporaries. Now, I say match, I should clarify that these were primarily tournament games. Korchnoi didn't consider himself a very strong match player overall, and he talked about how rarely he actually played matches before the candidate cycle went to match play, but he was certainly a strong tournament player. I talked about politics a bit, and you should know that Korchnoi was not, there were seeds of his discontent from a very early age. First of all, you had the matter of Korchnoi's ethnicity. His mother was Catholic, his father was Jewish, and Korchnoi was not really clear on what his ethnicity should be. See, at this time in the Soviet Union, you could list your ethnicity as Russian, or you could list your ethnicity as Jew. And when Korchnoi was 16, he went to go get his passport, and he listed his ethnicity as Jew. And when he came back, his stepmom, who was also Jewish, berated him and convinced him of the necessity to go back and change that. So actually, his ethnicity, they went back to the passport office, and within a couple of days had his ethnicity changed back to Russian. They did not want the stigma attached to being labeled a Jew in a somewhat anti-Semitic country. Now, there were several players who had Jewish ties, Botvinnik being one of them, but it was still quite the stigma in Russian society to label yourself as anything other than Russian. You were considered not patriotic, and maybe with shifting alliances. So Tal listed his ethnicity as Jewish, and then it was changed to Russian. Incidentally, when Tal's son was born, he had his ethnicity listed as Armenian because his wife was Armenian, and his wife berated him for that and forced Korchnoi to change his son's ethnicity to Russian as well. So there was a couple times where Korchnoi really didn't necessarily want to be labeled as Russian, first of all. Second, he was not content with Russia's politics. He talks about an incident where he was at the university in Leningrad where he got a degree in history, and he talked about the fact in class that Russia had stabbed Poland in the back during World War II, or the lead up to World War II. And the room just went quiet, and he was fortunate that his professor or no one in the classroom reported on him, because this could have led to his expulsion and marginalization, essentially, even at such a young age. When he participated in tournament chess, he was able to travel internationally, but there were a couple of black marks on his file for things that you and I wouldn't really think that were that big of a deal, but were big deals to the KGB minders who came along on all of these trips. First of all, you may recall that there was an incident in Havana where Korchnoi and Tal went to a nightclub, and a young Cuban, smashed a beer bottle over, or an alcohol bottle over Tal's head. He had to get stitches, and the Soviet delegation was incensed by this, and Tal was punished for this. So was Korchnoi. There was a candidates cycle in Curacao in the Caribbean Ocean, or the Caribbean Sea, and while Korchnoi was participating, he went gambling a time or two, and that was seen as a very negative thing. You know, that was a capitalist type activity. That was not what a good communist does. And so these were dark marks on his record, and this cost him the ability to participate in some tournaments. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. First, tournaments were the #1 way to get good experience and improve as a chess player. Second, there was a financial reward attached to participating in tournaments. For example, if you participated in the Olympiad, the chess Olympiad for the Soviet team, you were able to if Russia won first place, which they almost always did, you received a bonus in rubles, the currency, which was about the equivalent of 8 times the average worker's monthly salary. So that was a significant financial reward, and there were a lot of politics that went into composing and getting on that team. There were a lot of backroom deals. For example, Korchnoi talks about how in 1952 Botvinnik didn't participate on the Olympiad team, and this was due to manipulation by Alexander Kotov, of all people. There's talk about Smyslov as former world champion, calling in some favors from politicians and getting himself named on teams and bumping other people off teams. There is what I think is perhaps the most egregious example is we talked a little bit in the, well, I guess in the Fischer lecture, we showed a picture of Fischer playing in the Piatgorsky Cup in 1963 in Los Angeles. It turns out that they had sent 2 invitations to the sports committee in Moscow. One for I think it was Karas, and the other for Korchnoi to participate in this tournament. Well, Petrosian, who is at this time the world champion, says, well, I should participate in this tournament. And the Piatgorskys say, oh, sorry, we didn't realize you wanted to participate. We'll send another plane ticket. So they send a 3rd plane ticket. Karas, Petrosian, Korchnoi. Well, Korchnoi doesn't go. Not only does he not go, he never even knows that he was invited. He doesn't find out that he was invited until 20 years later when he happens to be having an offhand conversation with Mrs. Piatgorsky. It turns out that what had happened is Petrosian took Korchnoi's plane ticket and gave it to his wife so that his wife could accompany him to that tournament. Wow, indeed. So, in other words, I want to give you a feeling for this kind of politics that goes on, this backbiting that goes on in the Soviet chess system that Korchnoi was quite involved with. And this was part of a greater Cold War and what became a hot war with Tigran Petrosian. Now, we've talked a little bit about Tigran Petrosian for various reasons. We had the Petrosian lecture. I told you that Petrosian was secretly a KGB agent and that he reported on events to the KGB, both in terms of how Soviet players were behaving during tournaments, but also what Petrosian was finding out from the contacts at these various international tournaments. We know that Petrosian wrote letters of denunciation with regard to a lot of people, including with regard to Korchnoi. We also have a couple of stories. One where Petrosian or Petrosian's wife Rona would organize training and assistance to Korchnoi's opponents. Now, I told you in the Petrosian lecture that there was this big issue of adjournments, and that during adjournments, oftentimes there was collusion where certain, chess experts and grandmasters would help other grandmasters with adjourned positions so that they could improve their own chances of scoring higher or winning a tournament. And a lot of that was organized by Rona Petrosian to benefit her husband. But we also, and that was what in the Petrosian lecture I conveyed, that was only against foreigners. It turns out that Rona Petrosian and Tigran Petrosian did the same thing against Korchnoi and other players to help boost Tigran's results. So there was some manipulation on that end as well. I talked a little bit about collusion in the 1962 candidates in the Fischer lecture, where he accused the Soviets of collusion. It turns out that Korchnoi substantiates that and says it was really collusion orchestrated by Petrosian, with Geller notably, to ensure that Fischer and Korchnoi would both do poorly in that tournament. So there was that kind of Cold War. Oh, another funny Cold War story. There was a tournament that Petrosian was playing in, and that Korchnoi was playing in, and Rona Petrosian phoned Korchnoi's wife and said that Korchnoi had had an affair with a local woman during the tournament. Now, I don't know if that was true or not. Korchnoi dismisses it as gossip, but the point is, when we talk about backbiting, it was pervasive. And in this photo, you have them being buddy-buddy sitting right next to each other analyzing games. And this is an interesting dichotomy that you run into with Soviet chess. It kind of reminds me, it's kind of like they have this solidarity in that they're compatriots trying to ensure the dominance of Soviet chess internationally, but inside there is an extreme amount of politics involved and an extreme amount of shifting alliances and backbiting and gossip and attempts to destroy each other's image that I hadn't anticipated, and I was frankly surprised to see it addressed to the extent that Korchnoi discusses. Now, this war, this Cold War, this rivalry between them became a hot war in 1974. They had an important match in Odessa in the Ukraine, and that was because Korchnoi refused to play in Moscow, where Petrosian wanted to play, obviously. That's where he lived. He had a little summer house in the countryside around there, and that would have been on his home turf, whereas Leningrad was Korchnoi's home turf. So they agreed to a match in Odessa. Now, this match was kind of hastily prepared, and so the table that they were playing at was not extremely solid. And Korchnoi talks about the fact that Petrosian was twitching his leg under the table while they were playing. Now, you may remember from the Petrosian lecture, I said, that there was this point where Petrosian took his pulse during a match with Spassky after he made a move and found that his heart was at 140 beats per minute. So you have this seemingly unflappable defender who's secretly a bundle of nervous energy. Well, he never showed it, although in the match with Korchnoi, he was twitching his leg under the table. And this caused their rickety chess table to shake. And this bothered Korchnoi, as, it's not really surprising that it would bother Korchnoi. And Korchnoi approached the arbiter about this a couple of times and tried to get him to intervene. Nothing really occurred from it. So Korchnoi himself intervened, and I'll read from his book. He says, the fifth game was played with the score standing at 2-1 in my favor. I gained some advantage from the opening. Petrosian again began shaking the table. It now seemed to me that with the connivance of the chief controller, he was doing this deliberately. He was disturbing my thinking. Stop shaking the table. You're disturbing me, I said. This isn't the marketplace. He replied, and he continued to do his dirty work. It was then that I uttered the sacred phrase, "This is your last chance." That was the last thing I said to him. Right to his death, we did not speak to each other again. Petrosian stopped shaking the table and adjourned the game in a winning position. He did not turn up for the resumption. Instead, he wrote a statement demanding that the result of the match be annulled. The score was 3-1 in my favor, and that he should be awarded a win on the grounds that I was preventing him from concentrating at the board. He made use of every possibility, blah, 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 but when the judgment did not go in his favor, Petrosian resigned the match. So it was contentious, to say the least. And this is not just indicative of Korchnoi's relationship with Petrosian. You have to understand that Petrosian, as a KGB agent and as someone with very close ties to Moscow's Central Committee and the Sports Authority, by taking on Petrosian, he was also taking on the chess establishment, which is going to come back to haunt him perhaps in various ways a little later on. So with that, let's discuss our second game, played a little earlier in Korchnoi's career, and again, I will turn it over to Warren for that.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. I've always said Smagan. Yeah. It sounds like it could be a curse word or something, but I don't know. All right. So in this game, it features another one of his favorite openings, which is the Grunfeld defense. And this is also aligned with his kind of style, right? In the Grunfeld, you generally let your opponent obtain a nice big pawn center, and then you counterattack it, right? So this was a favorite opening of his for many, many years. So in this game, white decides to play a conservative setup because he was not ignorant of Korchnoi's success on this line and the complicated main line, so he tries to play a little more offbeat. And this is kind of a solid line for white, although the problem is that black gets 2 bishops, right? And his e6 move is just a clever tactical trick because black threatens both this knight and this pawn on d5, right? So white will not be able to obtain this pawn advantage. Now, as reference here, white has another interesting move in queen d2, and if e takes, queen e3. And Korchnoi also had several games of this line. But here, black can play king f8. And it's a really imbalanced position where black's king is awkward, but so is white's queen. So, just for your reference. But white was not feeling so feisty in the opening. He just played back. Now, white did play this game kind of conservatively, and his mistake really was not in initiating a minority attack earlier. Now, this kind of pawn structure with these pawns like this is generally called a Carlsbad. Okay, and white's counterplay is going to come in the form of trading these 2 A and B pawns for black's A and B pawns, and ideally saddling black with a backwards pawn on c6, and then attack it with the rooks and pieces, right? So this is what white would like to do, and by delaying it, white loses quite a bit of chance for initiative because the problem is that black's 2 bishops make it hard in the long term for white to accomplish his plan. So if you're wondering where white went wrong because it looks like white didn't do anything wrong, that was basically it. He should have played more ambitiously, but we won't concentrate on his mistakes. So again, he kind of pursues the incorrect plan here. He really needs to get this b pawn rolling. So black's just developing his pieces harmoniously. Since white's not doing anything, he gets all his pieces into the game. Now this is a really grandmasterly move. That the idea is not really to attack this weak e pawn. It's just to make sure that now that your rooks are connected, you can utilize these other squares for your pieces, like maybe c8 for a bishop or something like that. So it's not so much to create a concrete threat, but just to aggregate your pieces in the center, right? So, by the way, I'll just mention here, bishop f5 may look like a kind of a non-move, but black actually has a threat. What is black threatening here? What's that? Yeah, so he's threatening bishop takes d4 because this bishop on e2 is hanging. So it may look kind of like a non-move, but opens up the e file. So that's what white was doing, bishop f3. So here, white doesn't want to take that because now white's never going to be able to play b5, right? And this c5 square is owned by black. So he occupies it. But, and this is another important point, in this Carlsbad pawn structure, knight on d6 is generally very strong. Okay, and the reason it's so good is because it controls 2 very important squares. You control, first of all, this b5 square. And that's important because of what I mentioned in white's earlier plan, is that white wants to play b4, b5 and undermine c6. But now b4, b5 is very hard to achieve, right? Because black's going to play a6 and then say, okay, when are you going to play b5? Now it also controls this e4 square, which is important because it prevents white from opening up the center, right? So just as a general rule for you guys in your own games, if you ever find yourself in this Carlsbad pawn structure, remember that knight on d6 is a very excellent square for that knight. So you'll oftentimes see maneuvers in Grandmaster games. They'll mysteriously play like knight e8 or something. It might make more sense now if you understand that that knight is heading for d6. So anyway. So h5 is another kind of grandmasterly move. So the idea here is just to weaken the king side here for white. So it's not so much to launch a direct checkmating attack, but to merely remove a pair of pawns defending the white king. Okay. Now g3 trying to prevent black from obtaining iron pawn on the h file. So for example, as black's move again, he would play h4, and at g3, black would play h3, right? Taking that kind of pin down there. In the game, he decides to exchange, but he could have considered h3. Now, this is what I was talking about with having these squares available for pieces. So black was able to utilize the square on c8 for that bishop. Now, if the rook were on a8, it would look kind of silly. But here, it has no downside. The bishop doesn't need to be over on the king side to have influence. So here, Korchnoi kind of signals that he's playing for win. He could have just exchanged on h3 and been somewhat equal, but with f5, he blocks piece trades. And he's intending queen h6, g5, and attacking on the king side. Right, so it's looking kind of dangerous for white. So Samagan tries to change the character of the play. So again, Korchnoi is trying to advance. He plays this interesting sacrifice on d5. Now he played this to mix it up, because if he just sits back, then black's going to have very easy play, and he's not going to have any counterplay. So even if it's not good, you're going to have to go for it. And this is another important moment for black. So black to play, what do you think? What do you think he would play here?
Rook f7.
So rook f7, it turns out what he played. Now, by the way, I'll mention you got to be careful about moving your king to like h7, because this is a pain to deal with, right? Now, knight f7 is also not a good idea, because white will take this pawn on b7, and white has excellent compensation for the piece. He has material compensation, 3 pawns, and now will look like an intimidating black kingside attack isn't so great, right? White can intend moves like rook c7 and try to build up the pressure on black here. So rook f7 is much more logical, because Korchnoi saw that because of the closed nature of the position, rooks are not so useful. Minor pieces are way more useful in closed positions like this, right? If a rook doesn't have an open file, it's not doing you much good. So this is why he didn't hesitate to give it up for that bishop. Of course, white wasn't going to give it up like that, because if you take the rook right away, then black just plays king takes, and white's king is very drafty, right? Rook h8 is immediate threat, right? So he's trying to open up the position. I mean, that's what you want to do when you have rooks, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't really work out so well. Korchnoi plays another very strong move here. I'll give you about a minute to look for it. Yeah, bishop e6. Yeah, very strong. Now, the problem with move like knight takes c4 is after rook takes, black's having problems here, because you can't take, because white takes on c8, right? So this is not an easy position. Now, bishop e6 attacks his bishop on d5. And getting a bishop to that square is pretty nice, because we have this mate on h1 being threatened. And this is absolutely deadly. So despite the fact that white can take a rook with check, it still is a problem, because now this rook is under attack. And if for example, white were now to take this, he has no time for respite, because his knight hangs and he's being threatened by this mate still. So in the game, he tried to block on e4, but this also didn't help. So he plays rook back, right? He can't block with a knight because the rook would then hang, right? And now Korchnoi played another very strong move. I'll give you a minute to find this.
I'll add bishop takes d4.
No, I think we.
Well, if
d4, would you get it with check? Oh no, yeah.
Queen can't take it.
Queen can't take it.
Because black queen comes.
Oh, the rook on c1 is hanging.
right. He did not play it. There was a reason for this. I think the reason is rook c2. Now the problem is these bishops are lined up over here.
So you're just take one.
Well, then you can take. Can't you take with the? Oh, you can with the bishop knight.
Well, black can take here, but the situation as a rise is not good, right? Black's down a pawn, and white's exchange pieces. I'll give you guys a hint. So the tactic is undermining.
the knight d6.
Yep, guards the rook on e4.
So you just go on rook to
G5.
f6, try to attack the knight?
Is it just g5?
Yeah, so black has to be careful here. So if you play a move like rook f6, you run into rook h4. So what Lucas mentioned, g5, was exactly what he
That
played.
was actually my first thought, but I thought that was just
Yeah, no, it's perfect. Now, in general, you don't want to rush to take this rook because it's pinned. You don't want to take it. And g5 is strong because it attacks the knight laterally, and it stops rook h4. It's just a very strong move. So white's in trouble here. White tried to resist, but it's pretty hard. These bishops beautifully control these important squares. So, black's threatening queen e4. Yeah, black just guards everything. He threw in a few checks, but doesn't really help. And here, he's back and resign, right? So, I think this game is pretty cool because of how easy Korchnoi made it look. And it was really a complicated position. Smagin sacrificed the piece, try to open things up, but the method with which Korchnoi played, putting the knight on d6, coordinating the rooks on the e and f files, and then conducting that kingside attack was pretty nice. So, anybody have questions about that game? I think it's a really instructive way of how to handle the black side of that Carlsbad pawn structure. Now, given that that's a way better version than you would normally get because black had the two bishops, right? And white delayed his counterplay, getting that minority attack going. So. All right. That was all I had for that one.
So I haven't really talked much about Korchnoi's chess achievements. I haven't shown any tournament cross tables. This is the first time I'm talking about a Soviet player, and I'm not talking about USSR championships. Korchnoi won a few. He plays highly in many. He says that from about 1947 on, he never finished worse than fifth in a tournament that he entered. He distinguished himself in many, many ways. He played board 3 in the match USSR versus the world, and he had a positive record. He 2.5 to 1.5, I think it was 1.5 to, or 2 to 1, I think, on his board, and that was the match where the Soviet Union barely won. So his point was very important. He was on television, he appeared in radio interviews, he appeared in chess publications, he gave simultaneous exhibitions and lectures. He was very prevalent in the Soviet chess scene, and what he says is, the Soviet leaders kind of came and went. There was Stalin, there was Khrushchev, and they were in the public's eye for a couple of years, but he was in the public eye for 30 years. And that may sound a little self-aggrandizing, but the fact is that Korchnoi had a claim to the fact that he was one of the chess elite and was therefore a sort of national hero. And I say all that because it might help you understand how the extent to which Korchnoi felt thrown under the bus when he played Karpov. Now, you'll recall that Fischer won the World Chess Championship in 1972, and according to the dictates of the championship cycle, there was a candidates tournament, and in the final of that candidates tournament, Karpov won a very closely contested match against Korchnoi to challenge Fischer for the World Championship. Korchnoi lost that match, and therefore he was not named de facto chess champion, as Karpov was when Fischer refused to play in the 1975 World Chess Championship match. But you may not understand why there was such a rivalry between Korchnoi and Karpov, and it starts with the fact that, at least according to Korchnoi, it starts with the fact that Karpov was Russian. 100% Russian. Korchnoi was not. He had a Jewish father. He had an Armenian wife. and he was not, ethnically pure. Also, his family had some money before the Second World War. He came from, I wouldn't say necessarily the nobility or the aristocracy, but he came from, kind of the equivalent of the upper middle class before everybody was made, according to Korchnoi, equal before Stalin and God in the late 30s. Karpov was not. He came from a working family, which was valued. You have the fact that Karpov was a lot younger. He was about 20 years younger than Korchnoi, and so he was considered by many to be the future. You had the fact that Karpov was a product of the Botvinnik school, and he had been, Russian-born, Russian-bred, Russian-trained, Russian everything. He didn't have any blemishes on his record. The KGB, the Soviet Central Committee, the Sports Authority, they all thought very highly of him. And it's quite clear that from the time that Spassky lost to Fischer, that the Soviet regime threw their support behind Karpov as the future, not only as the future of Soviet chess, but as the person who was going to dethrone Fischer and reclaim the chess title in their mind where it rightfully belonged, and that, that chess title would never leave Russia ever again. And we're going to talk about the Soviet chess machine and their support of Karpov again when we talk about Kasparov, incidentally. But understand that that Karpov had the support, and Korchnoi felt very acutely, even back to 1974, that he did not have that support. After the match, Korchnoi got in trouble because of his complaints about the match conditions and the support for Karpov, and this resulted in him receiving a 1-year travel ban. So he was not allowed to participate in international tournaments, which his stipend was removed, his passport was pulled. He was essentially persona non grata. This was not the first time the Soviet regime had taken these steps. They did the same thing against Taimanov when he lost 6-0 or 0-6 to Fischer in their candidates match. Taimanov was essentially issued a 2-year suspension, and that was pretty much the end of his chess career. After Korchnoi lost, and after he said some disparaging things in the press, and after Petrosian initiated a denunciation of Korchnoi, he was persona non grata in the Soviet chess community. His simul's were canceled, his lectures were canceled, he didn't appear in the media. He essentially disappeared. And this was probably the final straw. Korchnoi says at this point he resolved to defect. Now, he was under house arrest, essentially, not under house arrest, but his movements were closely tracked, and he didn't have papers to travel outside the country for a year, but he knew from this point on that when he could, he would. Now, Korchnoi had traveled internationally, made a lot of acquaintances. In 1973, he played a match in Augusta, Georgia with and he's pictured here with the governor of Georgia. You probably recognize Jimmy Carter. That's he and his wife, Bella, or Bella standing to Korchnoi's left, and Korchnoi standing to Carter's left, and there's Carter's wife to his right, etc. And then you have, some other officials traveling with that delegation. He had connections outside of the Soviet Union. From time to time, as he was traveling to various tournaments, people would come up to him and say things and offer help, and assistance in getting out of the country, and he always refused. But now he started thinking about, how he might actually make that happen. So he was prevented from leaving the country or traveling internationally. And the only thing that saved him, ironically, was Karpov, because Karpov won the chess championship by default. FIDE awarded the title to Karpov because he had won the candidates match and the right to challenge Fischer. But in many people's eyes, including Fischer's, Karpov's championship was illegitimate. and the Soviets in an attempt to legitimize Karpov's chess championship, arranged for Korchnoi to start playing in international tournaments again so that they could show that Korchnoi was a strong player and that Karpov was an even stronger player, and therefore it was perfectly legitimate for Karpov to be world championship. So in 1976, July 5th, 1976, Korchnoi traveled to a tournament in the Netherlands, and after his last round and after the closing ceremony, he asked his last round opponent and the person sitting next to him, "How do I say and spell political asylum?" And then instead of traveling back to the Soviet Union, he went to a government office in the Netherlands and requested political asylum. Took a while. It was eventually granted. Korchnoi then moved to Switzerland, where we'll see later on he became a Swiss citizen, and he represented Switzerland in the Olympiad for years to come. And incidentally, he won Switzerland's national championship in 2009 at the age of like 80. So, well, not quite 80, sorry, 77 only. So he became a Swiss citizen and lived there the remainder of his life. But as we will see, his family, at least immediately, did not join him. And we'll get to that after we discuss our third game, which was a game against Geller, who's pictured here. This is not actually a picture from their match. They were playing opposite colors, but I thought it coordinated pretty well.
All right, so this game is from, he was going through the candidate cycle again, and he was playing Geller. I think this was the quarterfinal. So this was the second round of the candidates. And we've seen at least one other game from Geller. I think he's been the victim of one or two games that I've showed here. Now, Geller was a player strong in his own right, but he never achieved the heights of like Korchnoi. But I just want to mention that he wasn't just a
tomato can.
Yeah, he wasn't just a tomato can or pin cushion or something like that. Okay, we've seen a lot of his losses, so just I don't even know if he's alive, but just a shout out, Anyway, so Korchnoi played another sharp game here. So let's get to the opening. So again, he plays a Sicilian, which, although it's not his favorite like the French, it's also a provocative opening, right? Because Black falls behind early on in development in order to get this advantage in center pawns, right? So another provocative opening. Now this was a pretty popular opening at the time, and Geller was regarded as somewhat of an expert in this variation of the Sicilian. Now, although this game was played via the Najdorf move order, this is really more of a main line in what's called the Scheveningen defense, right? Now, I should go back to the opening and point out, so the reason that Korchnoi avoided e6 is because of g4, okay? And Geller had some good success with this. So by playing a6 first, he avoids this variation, okay? Okay, now a opening point here. So all this is pretty standard for this opening. Now, the point of a4 is to stop a future b5. Now today, and as Kasparov played it in his later World Championship matches with Anand and who else did he play with? Karpov. The most accurate move here is rook e8 now is known. It's simply a flexible move waiting to decide where this bishop's going to go. Because oftentimes white will remove this knight from the center, and in that case, then black can fianchetto this bishop to a more active square. Now in the game, Korchnoi chose bishop d7, which is all right. It's just less precise than rook e8, because now this bishop is going to be passive in case of a white knight b3. Okay. But as we'll see, Korchnoi employs a kind of unique but pretty solid setup. He finds a useful role for that bishop. Now here, Geller was probably playing a little bit too conservatively. G4 is probably what he should do here. You kind of have to take advantage of black's somewhat passive setup here. So he didn't really react too energetically, although his position was fine. And this move Rook C8 apparently was kind of upsetting for Geller because he was expecting Korchnoi to come up with some sort of plan, and really this is kind of a waiting move. So this is kind of a mix of Petrosian just waiting for your opponent to do something and being provocative at the same time, right? He's just kind of telling Geller, there's that scene in The Matrix where Neo does this little hand wave inviting the attacker to come at him. That's kind of what the equivalent in chess would be. So Geller tries to aim for this e5 break, okay? And bishop f6 is especially provocative because white can play e5 with gain of tempo, okay? Now the point of e5 in these Sicilian positions is that you gain the e4 square for your pieces. So here white can occupy it with bishop or knight. It's just a very useful square. So, and Korchnoi decided to provoke it with gain of tempo for the sole reason that now white has a weakness. Isolated pawn. Yeah. So if pieces get traded off, if white does not checkmate black, white's going to have a bad endgame. Okay. So these kind of double-edged positions Korchnoi really enjoyed. The onus is kind of on white here to prove that he can make use of this pawn in the middle game. So white's centralizing more pieces. Rook a7 instead of rook b8 because you want to defend along the 7th rank. And he's also defending a6, coincidentally. Now things are looking a little bit scary for black because white is now intending to play moves like knight e4, knight f6 check, right? And it's starting to look kind of scary. So here he comes up with a very inventive defense. He noticed that the problem was white's work on g4, so plays h5. Now this was really non-standard way of defense for that time because the general rule of thumb was if you're being attacked on one side of the board, you don't move all your kingside pawns and further weaken your position, right? That's just a general rule of thumb when you're getting attacked, right? You don't want to make your king drafty, right? But here the unique tactical nature of the position means that he can't tolerate that rook on the g file. So here it's fully correct to push it away. So it forces white to kind of waste time. And here and on the next several moves, what white should have done was taken this pawn on h5 just to open up the position. Now it's unclear if it actually wins or not. Even with modern day analysis, it's hard to give it a definite conclusion of whether white's winning or not because black is able to move that knight over to the king side and it's complicated. And Geller didn't see a concrete continuation either. And of course, knowing Korchnoi's reputation of being an excellent defensive player, he just didn't have the guts to do it, right? So that was really a problem. He tried to mark time with h3, but unfortunately with this permanent weakness on e5, white can't afford that kind of thing in this position. Black slowly improving his position. One more piece protecting the king, right? And it targets his pawn at e5. So pretty nice. Black attacks his pawn at a4, right? Now black's just trying to trade pieces and go into that endgame that we've already remarked is going to be good for black. And black just slowly rests the initiative because unfortunately white's opportunity for attack is really already passed. Yeah, this move was unnecessary. It's not necessarily easy to make a suggestion, but before immediately runs into problems because of this. Right? If c takes d3, then this is just a really depressing position for white, right? He has a weak pawn on e5, a weak pawn on d3, and a very bad bishop. So he decides to sacrifice a pawn, but he does not really obtain compensation. It might look like black's king could be weak, but Korchnoi defends accurately. Rook d5 defends his g5 square, so white can't even dream of checkmating, right? And then here he resigned because black's going to forcefully trade more pieces. For example, queen f3, just rook f5, right? And then trade, and then queen c1, and so on. It's just a depressing situation for white. So, this game is pretty interesting. It looked like he just crushed Geller, even though Geller could have had great attacking chances on the king side. But Korchnoi played really inventively, moving his kingside pawns like that. Really non-standard way of defending, but just took into account the tactical nuances of the position, realized that he couldn't tolerate that rook, even if it was weakening his king severely. So, any questions about that game? No? Okay.
So, obviously, defecting from the Soviet Union and being the first Grand Master to defect in such a public way was quite the embarrassment. And you can bet there was a significant amount of fallout. First, the fallout targeted his family. So Korchnoi's son Igor, pictured here, this was basically the last time that Viktor saw him for about 6 years. It was also the last time he saw his wife for about 6 years. So even though he was able to correspond with them and exchange letters from time to time, not only was his family prevented from leaving, they were essentially under house arrest, and when they left, they had a KGB minder tailing them to make sure that they did not have any chance to escape the country. Now, this was quite a strain on Korchnoi's relationships, both with his wife and his son. It was also a strain on Korchnoi personally. Incidentally, in 1982, they were granted exit visas, and his son, his wife, and his stepmother, Rosa Abramova, who is still alive, they joined him in Switzerland. But at this time, Korchnoi's relationship with his wife is beyond salvage. They divorce. She later dies in, I think it was 1995, of Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. And his stepmother, Rosa, stays in Switzerland for a bit, but then she moves to Israel. She was Jewish. She lives there and dies of old age in the late 90s. And then his son, it's not clear what their relationship was like after the defection, but it was certainly damaged. His son had not only not seen his father for 6 years, but he was conscripted into the army for a couple of years. He had tried to go AWOL and escape, and then he was thrown in prison. And it was not a pleasant time for them. And Korchnoi, despite doing well in the candidate cycle, had to face the prospect of playing in the 1978 World Championship against Karpov under the duress of his family being essentially imprisoned in Russia. And so there were a lot of different aspects of this particular match that are worth discussing. For one, Korchnoi strongly felt that he was being targeted by the Soviets and by the KGB, and that he may face assassination. You remember Fischer had a similar fear, and that's part of what drove his paranoia and his descent in the wilderness years. And Korchnoi did much the same thing. When he first defected and requested political asylum in the Netherlands, he hid for a while in the homes of various friends, convinced that the KGB or communist sympathizers, of which there were many all throughout different countries, would come for him. Anyway, he resumed tournament chess. He was quite happy, despite the fact that he didn't have his family with him. Played in the 1978 World Championship, but if the deck was stacked against him before, in the 1978 championship, it was even more extreme. First of all, Korchnoi could not really find a second or a trainer to play with, because everyone that he approached was essentially told that if they helped him in any way, shape, or form, that not only would they be excommunicated from Soviet chess, if you will, but they might also be denied the ability to compete in international tournaments, or if they were international players, they might lose the ability to get travel visas to play in tournaments in the Soviet Union. And so Korchnoi went into this tournament basically by himself. He had he had a couple people that went with him. Incidentally, he tried to recruit William Lombardi to go there with him, as Lombardi had gone with Fischer, but that didn't quite work out. So instead, he went with Raymond Keane, who he felt later stabbed him in the back, and he went with a young manager by the name of Petra Luerick, who had been imprisoned in a Soviet prison for 10 years and who had a strong animosity toward the Soviet Union and was not afraid to express it. And she was kind of his manager, and they ended up getting married later on. But so you should know that Korchnoi really believed in parapsychology. He was a big believer in astrology, palm reading, communication with the dead, seances, mental influence, this, that, and the other, and whether or not it has any basis in reality, the point is he believed it and it affected him. So Karpov brought with him a certain Vladimir Zukar. You've probably heard about the War of the Psychologists, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Vladimir Zukar was a psychologist that worked with Karpov, and here's what Korchnoi says. He says, a few days passed, it became clear that this was a Soviet psychologist who had been brought over. Vladimir Zukar sat right beside the stage, not stirring for the full 5 hours. It was obvious that he was working every day with Karpov, apparently carrying out hypnotic seances with him before a game and visually encouraging the champion during play. At the same time, he would endeavor to meet me as often as possible away from the board, letting me know that he was acting negatively on me and would continue to do so. I began hiding from Zukar, trying to spend as little time as possible at the board on the stage. So whether or not Zukar had any perceivable effect, he certainly did on Korchnoi. There were mind games being played, and Korchnoi brought his own psychologist over. He says, meanwhile, my psychologist had also arrived in Baguio, the city where in the Philippines where this championship took place. Unnoticed by anyone, Dr. Bergener took his place in the 5th row. On the day of the 11th game, Zukar was paralyzed. Karpov played quickly but thoughtlessly. I won and leveled the series in the match. And he says, his doctor was recognized by the KGB and the Soviet minders as a threat, and that they chased him off, and that he ended up leaving because he was harassed so much. But it was kind of this battle of the parapsychologists, and he talks about Karpov and his tactics that were trying to unsettle Korchnoi. He says that. You remember the thing about Petrosian and the tapping of the leg under the table and how that annoyed him? Well, he talks about Karpov, and he says, at times when I was considering my move, he would begin swiveling in his chair, he being Karpov. I stood up from the board and, adopting a Spassky-like pose, began studying the position on the demonstration board. Schmid, this would be Lothar Schmid, the chief arbiter of both the Fischer-Spassky match and, incidentally, the Korchnoi-Karpov match, came up to me and asked what the matter was, and Korchnoi would tell him that this was bothering him, but Schmidt wouldn't really do anything about it. That sounds familiar, right? And there was a point where Korchnoi calls Karpov out on it. He talks about. He says, subsequently, Karpov several times resorted to this weapon. Like a naughty schoolboy, he would begin swiveling his chair when the arbiters were not watching him. Well, what Korchnoi's approach was to wear mirrored sunglasses, because he claimed that this prevented this unnerved Karpov, because it forced Karpov to stare at his own reflection. Yeah. And for two, it prevented Dr. Zukov from doing his little mental damage. And then my final favorite thing is a couple of local yogis. These were Americans who had become yogis. They came and they're pictured here. They were named Didi and Dada. That's what they were called. They came and became like gurus for Korchnoi. So here he is doing yoga in anticipation of one of his games, and they kind of coached him on what to do to kind of nullify the effect of Zukar. And it's pretty funny. It says, There was a strange incident just before the 21st game. The yogis taught me one phrase in Sanskrit. If I were to see Zukar, it would be useful to say these words to him. Indeed, before the 21st game, Zukar arrived and headed directly towards me, apparently in order to shake my hand. Staring him straight in the eye, I blurted out the prepared phrase. He covered his head with his hands and stepped back. After this minor victory, my game went like clockwork. I won it after the adjournment, and the score became 4-2. What these anecdotes illustrate, beyond anything else, is that Korchnoi believed it, and Karpov, to a certain extent, believed it, because these mind games became quite prevalent in their match in both 1978 and 1981. And I just chuckle because I wasn't, I was barely born at this time, but I've only really followed World Championship chess recently, and I have a hard time imagining, Anand having a parapsychologist sitting next to him trying to psych Carlsen out, and Carlsen tapping his foot or swiveling in his chair to try to disconcert Anand. I just, you don't hear about that sort of thing anymore, and maybe it reached its peak with Karpov and Korchnoi, and then settled down after that. But there were certainly mind games. Now, we've talked about mind games, but let's talk about the actual games. Remember, Korchnoi considered himself in his peak at this point. So let's look at how he did. This is from game 31 of their match. And there is Karpov engaging in some mind games, incidentally. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great picture.
That's from his book. Yeah, I couldn't find that anywhere else. But
that's a very tall like stare. Yeah, the following game we're going to look at is really... It's one of the more instructive games that I've seen Korchnoi play, actually. So this was a 31st game of their 1978 World Championship match. So this was towards the end. I think this was actually the penultimate game. I think there was only one more game after this, although I'm not certain. But it was very, very instructive to see what happened. So the game started off as a Queen's Gambit decline, and very quickly it turns into a Carlsbad pawn structure like we were just talking about. Okay, well, we have these pawns on e3 and d4 and d5 and c6, right? So again, but this time Korchnoi's on the white side. He's attacking it, and it's really interesting to see how he plays against it. Now, of course, this is a way better version than his Grunfeld game because Black doesn't have the two bishops. But nonetheless, it's really interesting. He plays a really unique setup. So let's get to that. So again, unlike his opponent in the other game, he immediately, without hesitation, plays his b4 move. He wants to play b5 right away and saddle Black with this pawn. Now, of course, Karpov's playing moves to prevent this. Bishop g4, threaten double pawns. And then rook c8 makes the opening of the c file a little bit unnerving for White. Okay. So White strives to exchange pieces. And here White makes a really interesting decision. And during the game, I guess the commentators really criticized this move because after Karpov's a6, they didn't understand what Korchnoi was going for, because White's hope in this position is to use this minority attack to give Black weakness on the queen side. But now the pawns are fixed.
So he has a home on b6?
It turns out that he locked the king side in order to be able to expand on the queen side, on the king side, not king side, center, right? And this is a pretty unique plan in this position, and apparently commentators at this point even thought that Karpov was going to seize the initiative. They thought Korchnoi had made this elementary positional blunder, because now White's primary idea in this position is gone, right? And it looks like Black controls the center quite well, but you'll see how Korchnoi handles this unique position. It's really interesting. So, of course, Black does not want to take his knight, because then he will have this permanent weakness on b7. So Black is definitely not going to take it. So he's just going to defend. And Korchnoi, and now in this endgame, activates his king. So he's going to put it on d3. It turns out to be a very nice square for him. He guards both c4 and e4. It's a very active square. Now, this is really a judgment call here. Now, it's always tricky to say when it's a good idea and bad idea to put your king in the center. It turns out here it works out fine. But sometimes you do have to be careful in these queenless middle games like this because your king can become exposed. But here his judgment's correct. The king is active there and not really exposed. And you can go ahead and stop me if you have a question about a particular move, but really they're just kind of maneuvering and marking time. Now, Korchnoi on purpose, he prepares this e4 pawn break for white, but he does so very slowly. And you'll see that he tries to avoid playing it before move 40 because he wanted to keep Karpov thinking and using time. Because in this kind of position, every move black has to calculate e4. Because to play at the right moment, e4 can be very strong. So he wanted to force Karpov to expend energy. So he's just kind of toying with him by maneuvering his pieces back and forth. Okay. So again, you'll see he refuses to play that e4 move, just waiting. And finally, in move 41, he plays e4, right? It's not a coincidence, I'm just pointing that out. So now the position opens up, and it turns out that his endgame is actually pretty good. These advanced queens-like pawns provide a nice position. And here, this is a really cool endgame. So he plays another accurate move, f5. Now, this move may seem kind of strange, but the idea is that he gets the e6 square for his rook.
And the f6 pawn is weak, too.
Exactly, yeah, he's pitting that pawn as well. And it turns out white has a cool conception here. So, now King c3 was actually not the most precise move. With analysis, it turns out rook e6 was slightly better, with the idea of playing similar as in the game with a6 and or rook d6, d7, right? But his king c3 move really initiates his plan, and it's really a unique one of bringing the king over to the queen side, even sacrificing a pawn to do it. So this key move here, a6, just with the idea of invading on the queen side. And here is definitely a great example of activity above all else in the endgame. The difference in the power of the kings is just night and day. Despite black having two connected passed pawns, his endgame is lost. Simply because of the active position of white's king and the fact that white's going to create a very dangerous passed pawn. Because the c pawn is going to cause black problems here. And it's really pretty to see how Korchnoi converts this. So here, king c6, threatening checkmate, right? So black has to lose the pawn with check, right? Just a precise move. Clearing the path for the c pawn and exposing these pawns to attack. Just mopping up the black pawns. And now finally black's left in a hopeless rook endgame, right? He played a few more moves, but this is not a very fun game to play, right? So this is lost. But this was a really instructive game. Just how, everyone thought that white's only idea in this position was to achieve this minority attack. But Korchnoi showed a whole brand new plan. So Korchnoi was really creative, and even though he was older and maybe not as well known as other players, he contributed a lot to chess. And this is a great example of how creative he was. And we all know how great Karpov is in the endgame. And he made Karpov look like a little kid, right? I mean, he completely outplayed him and just really overshadowed his judgment here. Karpov really underestimated the importance of the activity of white's king in the center there. So did the commentators that were commenting on the game, too. Everyone was kind of surprised by the result. They're kind of scratching their heads. So I think this is one of the more instructive games. Does anybody have any questions about this?
I have one.
Sure.
How do you judge when it's safe to move your king into the center of the board? you never do it if there were queens on the board.
Yeah.
But when there's two rooks, I mean, to me, I would wait until there's like only one of the three major pieces that are still left, and where you'd have a chance. You take quite a risk if you do.
Yeah, that's a really tough call. I guess, generally speaking, you'd want to make sure that the pawn structure is kind of static. So here, I think it's justified because Black doesn't really have any hope in opening up the center. So even though there are lots of pieces on the board still, normally it would be too soon to put your king out there, right? Because even though it's an endgame, there's 2 rooks, 2 pairs of minor pieces.
Yeah, if the D and E pawns weren't on the board,
you would never do
toast.
that.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so I guess it can be a tough judgment call, and a lot of times it'll just depend on the position. But as a good rule of thumb is that if you're an endgame and the pawn structure is very static, maybe it's a good idea to activate your king right away. And that's what Korchnoi did, and it proved decisive. Yeah. And it's really interesting how easy it is for White to do it, because White just plays king f1, king e2, king d3, and his king is awesome. Well, Black, it's kind of hard because his pieces are congested. They're kind of in the way, right? He can't just play king here and king here and king here, So it's much harder. So really that's White's advantage in the position, and Korchnoi really had a deep understanding to show that the king activity was decisive here. So it's pretty cool. For me, this game makes a huge impression. But, yeah. Any other questions? By the way, you'll also see in this game that Karpov put this knight on d6 in this Carlsbad pawn structure, right? Just pointing that out again. Here, though, it's not quite as great because Black is never able to launch kingside counterplay. So all the knight did was restrict the b5 pawn break, which was not White's hope anyway. So Karpov probably could have improved, but it was a more difficult position to play with Black. Any other questions there? All right.
So just so you know, you may remember that Fischer demanded that FIDE change the World Championship structure so that there was an unlimited number of games, and that to win you had to win 10 matches, and that you had to win by and that the challenger would have to win essentially 10-8 or 10-8, to win the championship. Now, that request was rejected, which, among other things, resulted in Fischer resigning his World Championship. But it's interesting to note that FIDE adopted many of those recommendations for this match. And so they played an unlimited number of games until there were 6 wins. Now, after 27 matches, Karpov was leading 5 wins to 2, if you throw out all the draws. But by this match, by the end of the 31st match, the score was tied 5-5. Korchnoi had made quite the comeback, and all of a sudden a match that looked like it was going to Karpov now looked like it could go either way, and Korchnoi had the momentum, winning 3 of the past 5 games. 27, 28, 29. Yeah, 3 of the 5 games. And so Karpov took his last time out. According to Korchnoi, he needed to repair his nervous system and repair some holes in his opening preparation. Also, Dr. Owa left the Philippines after this to attend to other matters. And according to Korchnoi, Dr. Owa, who was really the only person who had the ability to keep the Soviets in check. And so, according to Korchnoi, after this, the Soviets began manipulating things. So, for example, they arranged things so that Korchnoi's yogis were not only banned from the playing room, they were banned from the hotel, and they were banned from Korchnoi's villa where he was staying. In other words, the Soviets had convinced the authorities to ban a part of Korchnoi's delegation, which is something that Dr. Owa said would not be allowed. But the Soviets got away with it. Second, Korchnoi believes that there was a conspiracy between Campomanes, who was a Filipino billionaire or millionaire who had put forth the money for this match, and Raymond Keane, who was Korchnoi's second, to feed information to the Soviets, partly about Korchnoi's thoughts and analysis and maybe even adjournments, but maybe as well opening prep. For example, in Game 32, which was the deciding match, as Warren talked about, Korchnoi played a novelty in the opening, and he says that Karpov responded almost immediately, and he made a very precise move. Now, I don't mean to detract from Karpov's ability as a player, but Korchnoi believes that he may have been monitored, that his hotel room may have been bugged by the KGB, by the Russians, and that the information that they were preparing may have been communicated to Karpov. Also, the good psychologist, Dr. Zhukov, was back, and he was, and Korchnoi's yogis weren't there to kind of counteract this. And Korchnoi lost the match in this game. It was adjourned, but Korchnoi said, that he may not resume it, and Keane actually took it upon himself to contact the tournament organizers and say that Korchnoi was going to resign without Korchnoi officially saying he was going to resign. But anyway, the match ended under somewhat auspicious or somewhat troublesome conditions, but then again, the whole match was that way. There was a rematch, there was a rematch in 1981 that was not nearly as close, and essentially Korchnoi was again playing under the duress of knowing that his family was under arrest. After this, Korchnoi basically said that he wasn't going to play Karpov ever again, and that feeling was probably mutual. And Korchnoi played in a couple of candidates tournaments after that, but he never made it as close to the World Championship. So he played essentially in 74, which at that point he didn't know was for the World Championship, but was. Played again in 78 and played again in 81, and Moran did not win. He instead became I wouldn't say a friend, but he developed an understanding with a young Garry Kasparov who faced similar issues with Karpov. Korchnoi had extended an exceptional courtesy to Kasparov in the next World Championship cycle, which began in 82. Kasparov was not allowed to leave the country to play Korchnoi in Los Angeles. So Korchnoi could have won by default, but instead he said, no, I want to play Kasparov, and they arranged a match in London, which Kasparov eventually won, and Kasparov qualified for the World Championship cycle, played Karpov. We'll discuss that in subsequent lectures. But the point is, that was a very noble gesture on his part that Kasparov appreciated, and Korchnoi certainly saw a lot of himself in Kasparov in terms of being the victim of the Soviet political machine and their sponsorship of Karpov, et cetera, et cetera. And they I don't know, what the current relationship is like, but there's certainly some solidarity felt there. Now, Korchnoi, he moved to Switzerland, lived a fairly happy life. There's him with his second wife, Petra. And it's interesting to note that Korchnoi stayed involved with chess. I talked about longevity in the very beginning. I showed a picture on the title slide of a very old Viktor Korchnoi, and that was intentional because right now, November 2014, Viktor Korchnoi's FIDE rating is 2499 at the age of 83. And Warren informed me, now he did have a stroke a couple of years ago and he stopped playing competitively. I think 2011 was maybe his last rated tournament. But Warren tells me he's played a two-game match this year and played fairly well. I mean, pretty well, particularly when you consider that he's 83 years old and he's had a stroke and he's pretty much wheelchair bound. But you see Korchnoi still participating in the future of chess. There he is playing. There he is with Lev Aronian, and yeah, there he is whooping up on a very young Magnus Carlsen.
still drinks those orange drinks.
The famous Carlson orange juice.
Yeah, and his little Tupperware thing of snacks that mommy or daddy probably made. Sorry, Magnus.
Kill for that orange juice.
So he's stayed involved, and he has defeated. I think that he's defeated now every world champion from Botvinnik onward. And I don't know of anybody else who could make that claim. He's beaten Carlsen, he's beaten Anand, he's beaten Kasparov, he's beaten Kramnik, he's beaten Karpov, you know, so there are very few people who could make that claim. And as the final kind of feather in his cap, which I thought was a pretty remarkable achievement, in 2011, at a tournament in Linares, you have an 80-year-old Viktor Korchnoi defeating an 18-year-old Fabiano Caruana. And I hear Caruana's pretty good. This was perhaps the last, I don't want to say hurrah, but I think it's indicative of the fact that even at a very advanced age, Korchnoi has retained his chess faculties better than any other player we've looked at in this series, and frankly better than any other chess player that I'm aware of in the history of chess. I don't know that you could pick another player who could claim that they've been at the upper echelon of chess, meaning the top 100 in the world, from the ages of 16 to 80. And that's what Korchnoi has been. He's been in the top 100 in FIDE ratings pretty much since FIDE existed. Now, nowadays, his rating has declined as he's become inactive. It's only 24.99. But the point is that he has retained his mental faculties in a way that is frankly astonishing in an era where the stronger chess talents tend to be 25 to 40 years old. So for this lecture, I used essentially 3 books. I used Korchnoi's autobiography. Warren used Kasparov's Great Predecessors Volume 5, which is covering Karpov and Korchnoi. And then finally, there's a book that I used in the Spassky lecture talking about how the KGB tried to infect his girlfriend with STDs. And I also used it in this lecture, and it's called The KGB Plays Chess. What's interesting about this is Korchnoi is a co-author of this, so he's speaking from personal experience. But also you have Vladimir Popov, who was a former lieutenant colonel in the KGB who later defected to the West. And so you have Korchnoi talking about events, and you have Popov essentially corroborating it, because he was an attaché that worked with the sports authority, and his responsibilities included supervising chess activities in the Soviet Union during this time period. So fascinating. If you're looking for a quick, pretty much completely historical read, as opposed to a lot of other books which contain a lot of analysis, I'd highly recommend it. So, as always, feel free to ask any questions you might have. Of course.